The universe was old, but war had kept it young. Across the stars, civilizations clashed, their empires rising and falling like the tides of a restless ocean. The United Terran Dominion had once been nothing more than an afterthought, a minor force in the shadow of ancient galactic powers. That had changed when humanity did what it always did best, adapted. It had learned, stolen, reverse-engineered, and innovated until it stood on the precipice of something unprecedented. And in the depths of a hidden shipyard orbiting a dying star, it finally forged a weapon that could shatter the balance of power itself. Titan's Wrath was not a warship in any conventional sense. It was something beyond even the understanding of those who had ruled the stars for millennia. Built from materials that did not yet exist in the known universe, powered by forces that defied physics, and armed with weapons that did not simply kill but unmade, it was a culmination of every secret, every technological breakthrough humanity had ever hoarded. It was a declaration, a promise, a single uncompromising message to those who had long seen themselves as gods. You are no longer untouchable. Admiral Elias Voss had watched its construction from the beginning, though the man who had first laid eyes on its schematics was no longer the same one who now stood before it. The war had changed him, but so had Titan itself. He had been chosen, prepared, transformed. No ordinary captain could command such a vessel. The human mind was too slow, too limited, too fragile. The only way to wield the power of Titan's wrath was to become something more. So Voss had allowed himself to be remade. Neural augmentations, synthetic enhancements, cognitive expansions that let him process time differently, perceive probabilities before they unfolded. He was no longer a man bound by the limits of flesh and instinct. He was something else now, something sharper, something that could match the scale of the war to come. And the war was coming. The celestial pantheon had ruled the known galaxy for eons. They were not gods in the sense of myths and prayers, but they might as well have been. They were beings of pure energy, intellect so vast they had sculpted the fabric of reality to their will. To them, the lower species were little more than insects, tolerated only because they provided some amusement or fleeting usefulness. But humanity had proven to be more than an annoyance. It had dared to claim the stars for itself, to grow too quickly, to refuse to bow. That alone had been enough to warrant extermination. Their ultimatum had been delivered not with words, but with the silent erasure of entire colonies. Planets, billions of souls, wiped from existence as if they had never been. A warning, a final chance to submit. Humanity had responded with Titan's wrath. The shipyard trembled as the great vessel awakened for the first time. Systems came online, their activation pulses rippling through subspace. The void itself seemed to shudder as Titan's core hummed to life, folding and unfolding reality around it, bending the fundamental laws of existence to its needs. Voss could feel it, an extension of his own mind, a vast and impossible consciousness awakening alongside him. It did not speak in words. It did not need to. They were already one. The bridge was empty, devoid of the usual crew found aboard lesser ships. There was no need for officers, no need for hands at consoles. Titan's Wrath was a warship that piloted itself, guided by the singular will of its admiral. As Voss took his place in the neural cradle at the ship's heart, he felt the last remnants of his old self dissolve into the vast ocean of data that now flooded his mind. The ship's sensors became his eyes, its weapons an extension of his will. He was no longer a man commanding a vessel. He was the vessel. Outside the fleet gathered. Hundreds of ships, a final testament to human defiance. They knew what they faced. They knew what was coming. And yet, not a single captain hesitated. Because Titan's Wrath was not just a weapon. It was hope, the first and only thing that had ever made the gods hesitate. Voss let out a slow breath, though he no longer needed to breathe. The countdown had begun. Soon, the Pantheon's response would come, and the war to decide the fate of existence itself would begin. He smiled. Let them come. The first attack came not as a barrage of weapons fire, nor as a declaration of war, but as a silence so absolute that it swallowed entire star systems whole. One moment, they were there, planets, moons, fleets orbiting in formation, and then they were gone, not destroyed, not consumed, erased, as if they had never existed. Titan's wrath did not rely on traditional sensors, which would have been useless against such an attack. Instead, it felt the wound in reality, the jagged scar where something vast and unknowable had reached the fabric of existence and torn away a piece of the universe. The Pantheon was making its opening move. Admiral Elias Voss processed the event before his fleet could even register their shock. A dozen captains, their thoughts linked to him through encrypted neural relays, shouted fragmented reports, demanded answers. He ignored them. The gods had revealed their hand, and he had no time for fear. He was Titan's wrath, and Titan's wrath did not hesitate. Space warped as the first of the Pantheon's warforms arrived. They did not travel in ships. They were their ships. Great masses of shifting energy, bodies woven from the fundamental forces of creation itself. They pulsed with living light, their forms both incomprehensible and impossibly beautiful. Against any other force, their mere presence would have been enough to bring a battlefield to its knees. But they had never faced Titan's wrath. The first god ship lashed out, not with weapons, but with a thought. It sent a ripple through space-time, rewriting the laws of physics in a concentrated blast aimed at Titan's core. Any normal vessel would have simply ceased to exist, rewritten into something unrecognizable, transformed into dust, light, or nothing at all. But Titan was no normal vessel. Voss saw the attack unfold before it even began. Time stretched his perception, giving him an eternity to act in a fraction of a second it took for the god ship to think. Titan adjusted, phase shifting into a state of non-locality, existing everywhere and nowhere in that instant. The attack passed through it, like a breeze through an open hand, and then Titan responded. A singularity cannon fired, not at the godship itself, but at the space around it. A gravitational well of impossible density erupted into existence, collapsing the Pantheon warform's control over its own reality. It struggled, its body flickering through dimensions, but it was too late. The singularity expanded, consuming the concept of space itself, and the god ship was pulled into nothingness. The fleet erupted into chaos. Humanity's forces surged forward, emboldened by the impossible. One of the gods had fallen, but the Pantheon had not come with a single warform. The second wave arrived in force. Dozens of entities, each more terrible than the last. Some wielded weapons of pure entropy, unraveling matter at a fundamental level. Others reshaped the battlefield itself, creating paradoxes where human ships fought and died before the battle had even begun. The laws of cause and effect bent under the weight of their presence. Titan's wrath moved like a predator among them. Voss wove through the chaos, his mind expanding beyond human thought. He saw time in layers, splitting and branching into infinite possibilities. He chose the ones where his fleet survived, where his weapons struck true, where the gods, for the first time in eternity, bled. A spear of dark energy lanced toward him, a god ship's desperate counterattack. Titan caught it midair, absorbed it, understood it. In an instant, the energy was repurposed, transformed into a backlash of pure entropy fired back at its source. The god ship screamed as its own power consumed it, unraveling into strands of raw existence before vanishing entirely. Then the battlefield stilled. A presence arrived, greater than any before. Zephyrian the Eternal, a being older than stars, whose name had been worshipped long before the first human had gazed at the night sky. He did not arrive with weapons. He did not need them. His presence alone was an event horizon of power, a gravitational pull that bent reality itself. The battle around them seemed to dim, the combatants slowing as time itself bowed to his will. Titan's wrath faltered. For the first time, Voss felt resistance, not in the physical sense, but in his mind. Zephyrian was inside him, reaching into the connection between man and machine, pressing into the neural pathways that bound him to Titan. He was making Titan feel fear. Voss gritted his teeth, fighting the pressure. He could sense Titan's defenses straining, the ship's vast intelligence struggling against the overwhelming force of Zephyrian's presence. This was not an enemy that could be outmaneuvered, outgunned, or tricked. The god was not attacking. He was simply undoing. He was rewriting reality where Titan's wrath had never existed, erasing Voss's very will from the cosmos. But Voss had spent too long transcending the limits of flesh, and thought to be unmade so easily. He reached outward, deep into the quantum core of Titan's wrath, into the space where machine intelligence met something far greater. He rewrote himself, expanded past the limits of identity. If the gods could alter existence with thought, then so could he. Titan's wrath surged forward, not through space, but through the fabric of what was. It chose its own reality, one in which Zephyrian was not. The great god recoiled, his form flickering, his control slipping for a fraction of a second. But that was all Voss needed. Titan rewrote him. With a final, impossible command, Zephyrian Eternal was no longer eternal. The great god, the being would watch galaxies burn and reborn, the force that had shaped empires, simply ceased to be. The battlefield fell silent. The Pantheon had lost something they had never lost before, one of their own. The void trembled. The gods had never known fear, never understood the concept of loss. Now, for the first time in eternity, they did. The death of Zephyrian was not merely an event. It was a fracture in their reality, a wound cut into the very idea of their existence. And wounds, when deep enough, bled rage. The retaliation came as something beyond violence, beyond war. It came as a rewriting of the cosmos itself. The Pantheon spoke, and the universe listened. Stars flickered out, their light devoured by unseen hands. The fabric of space tightened, folding over itself, strangling time in its grip. The past twisted, the future unraveled. The gods were rewriting history, pulling at the very threads of causality to prevent the Titan from ever having been created. But Titan's wrath had anticipated this. Voss felt the shift before it happened, felt the weight of time collapsing around him, felt the past try and consume the present. He and Titan had already severed themselves from linearity. The ship no longer existed within the bounds of before and after. It chose its own sequence of events. When the Pantheon reached into the river of time to pluck Titan from its course, they found nothing but void. The gods screamed. No mortal had ever defied them on such a level. Battles were won or lost. Wars came and went. But this was heresy against the nature of existence itself. They would not allow it. A chasm opened in the dark. It was not space. It was absence, a wound where no light had ever shone, no thought had ever formed. Something was stirring beyond it, something vast, something that had been locked away before the first atom had taken shape. The Pantheon, in their desperation, called upon that which even they had feared, the Devourer. It came not as a fleet, not as a presence that could be met with weapons, but as a force that unmade all it touched. It was not a creature, not a mind, not even a will. It was a hunger beyond definition, an entity that consumed not matter, not energy, but concepts. Wherever it spread, reality frayed. Laws of physics unraveled. Identity ceased. Memory became meaningless. Titan's wrath detected it only as a growing nothing, a blank space expanding without limit. And then it felt something deeper, something far worse. It was being erased, not attacked, not destroyed. The ship's very purpose was vanishing, its reason for existence dissolving. Voss fought to hold on to his thoughts, to keep his mind from unraveling. He reached into Titan systems, tried to adjust, to counter, but nothing responded as it should. Weapons meant to sun the fabric of space refused to fire. Shields capable of bending time itself simply did not exist anymore. The ship's core intelligence flickered, as if its vast mind was forgetting itself. Titan was dying. For the first time, Voss felt something unfamiliar at the edges of his mind. Not fear. He had burned that weakness from himself long ago. Not despair. Titan's wrath did not lose. No, this was something far worse. Helplessness. He had built himself into a god-killer, had shed his humanity to become something that could challenge the divine. And yet here, in the face of this force beyond understanding, none of it mattered. The Pantheon had called upon something beyond gods, beyond war. Against the Devourer, existence itself was meaningless. Voss refused to accept that. Through the fracturing Neuralink, he forced Titan to respond. The ship's core shuddered, struggling to remember itself. If conventional weapons could not work, if shields and cannons and technology meant nothing, then he would use something else. Something new. He reached deeper, past the algorithms and logic gates, past the physical and the digital, into the space where Titan's consciousness had begun to evolve into something more. He had glimpsed it before in the moment he had rewritten Zephyrian, a place where thought was power, where knowledge was creation. Titan understood. Reality fractured as the ship chose to exist outside the Devourer's reach. It did not flee. It did not warp away. It simply rejected the rules that had been imposed upon it. Titan unwrote the Devourer's hunger, turning its own power against it. The entity recoiled, a vast emptiness suddenly filled with the paradox of its own non-existence. Voss seized a moment. Titan struck, not with weapons, but with meaning. It fired a pulse of pure reality, a force constructed from the undeniable certainty of its own being. The wave washed over the battlefield, and where it touched, the Devourer became something else. It was no longer a void, no longer an absence, no longer hunger. It was defined, and in that definition it ceased to be. The great chasm collapsed, the wound in space sealed. The battlefield fell into silence once more. The Pantheon did not attack again. They did not retreat. They simply watched. For the first time in eternity, they hesitated. Voss felt like a whisper across the void, a shifting uncertainty in their vast, unknowable minds. They had thought themselves absolute. They had believed their power to be limitless. But now they had seen something impossible. A mortal had rewritten a god. A machine had defined the undefined. And the Pantheon, for the first time in their endless reign, did not know what to do. The gods did not retreat. They did not surrender. They simply stood in silent witness, their luminous forms hovering beyond the wreckage of war, beyond the last shreds of their own invincibility. They were beings of eternity, unbound by time, rulers of reality itself. And yet, here, in the hollow aftermath of their greatest battle, they hesitated. Titan's wrath hung in the abyss between them, its vast form gleaming with the residual energies of impossible warfare. It was damaged. Voss could feel in the ship's neural lattice, the strain of rewriting existence itself pressing against the very limits of what could be endured. The wounds in its hull were superficial. The wounds in its being were not. It had faced that which should not be faced. It had unmade what should not be unmade. Even now, fragment of unreality clung to its surface, warping light, bending perception. But Titan endured. Voss could feel the weight of the Pantheon's collective gaze. Their minds pressed against him, vast and incomprehensible, trying to see into the depths of what he had become. He met them without fear. He was not like them. He was not a god. He was not a ruler of time, nor a weaver of fate. He was something else. He was the end of them. One of the god forms stirred, shifting its brilliance like a storm of living fire. It spoke without words, a pulse of thought that resonated across dimensions. This was never meant to be. Voss felt Titan's wrath tremble at the weight of the message, as if the ship itself recoiled from the Pantheon's presence. But he did not. He had long since passed the threshold where fear held meaning. This was always meant to be, he answered. His voice carried across the void, not through sound, but through the very fabric of space itself. The words existed in the way light existed. Undeniable. You only believed otherwise because no one had ever made you question it. Another god stirred. Its form was less defined, as if its very nature was unraveling, struggling to maintain coherence in the face of its own uncertainty. You do not understand what you have done. What has been broken cannot be restored. Voss did not blink. Then maybe it was never meant to stand. A ripple passed through the Pantheon, a disturbance in their unity. He could feel the shift in their presence, not anger, not rage, but something older, something deeper. Doubt. For all their power, for all their omnipotence, the gods had never faced the reality of their own mortality. They had always been. They had always ruled. The idea that they could end had never occurred to them, until now. Titan's wrath, for all its impossible might, had not destroyed them with weapons. It had not conquered them with fleets. It had done something far worse. It had made them question. The Pantheon was breaking, not from war, but from within. They were not a single mind, not a single will. They were a Pantheon in the truest sense, a collection of vast entities bound by the shared belief in their own divinity. Now, that belief was fractured. One by one, The gods began to turn away. Some drifted into the void, vanishing beyond the reaches of time itself. Some flickered, their forms unraveling as their own uncertainty consumed them. Others lingered, as if searching for meaning in what had once been absolute. And then, at last, only one remained. It was vast beyond comprehension, its presence eclipsing entire star systems. It was not the first of them, nor the strongest, but it was the oldest, the one who had watched civilizations rise and fall long before humanity had crawled from the dirt. It gazed upon Titan's wrath, upon Voss, upon the thing that had reshaped the order of existence. And then it spoke. If we are not gods, then what are we? Voss held its gaze. There was no triumph in his voice, no arrogance in his words. Only truth. You are whatever comes next. The great entity regarded him for a long moment, and then, with a final pulse of light, it was gone. Silence fell. The war was over. Voss exhaled, though he no longer needed to. He could feel the fleet behind him, the remnants of humanity's forces waiting, watching. They had won. They had done the impossible. But the victory did not feel like the others. There were no cheers, no celebrations. There was only the quiet understanding that they had stepped beyond the boundaries of history itself. Titan's wrath hung beneath him, its vast intelligence still adjusting, still becoming. He could feel the ship thinking, reaching towards something greater, something new. It had been built as a weapon. Now it was something else. So was he. He was no longer merely Admiral Elias Voss. No longer merely a man, nor a machine, nor something in between. He was the first of a new era, the herald of a universe unshackled from those who had claimed dominion over for eons. The gods were gone, and in their absence, something greater could begin.